On today's World Insight,
and the last manned aircraft is now clearing the airspace above Afghanistan.
an end to a 20-year U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. How could Afghans pick up the pieces from years of conflict? The legacy and big lessons of American occupation?
Hi, I'm Tian Wei, and this is World Insight coming to you live from Beijing. We begin today's special program, 20-year invasion ends with the latest in Afghanistan. National unity and the economy now the top priorities according to Taliban spokesperson after their fighters marched into Kabul International Airport, the last U.S.-held area in Kabul. U.S. troop presence in the country ended with flights from the airport before midnight Kabul time. A very chaotic end to a long 20-year war. In the past 2 decades, more than 240,000 people lost their lives as a direct result of the war, including tens of thousands of civilians in Afghanistan. Over the weekend, a U.S. drone strike also against a special suicide bomber in Kabul killed several civilians as well, including several children. The Taliban condemned the airstrike as unlawful. After the full exit, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, though, the U.S. may take some measure of diplomacy with Taliban, especially on the issue of vital national interests, end of quote. He also said the U.S. diplomatic mission in Kabul had to move to Doha in Qatar. Much uncertainty still grips Afghanistan, an uphill climb in rebuilding, and how inclusive the new government under the Taliban will be. On Monday, the UN Security Council held an emergency meeting and voted on an Afghanistan draft resolution with 13 votes in favor and 2 abstentions from China and Russia. Chinese Deputy Ambassador to the UN Geng Shuang pointed out the recent chaos in Afghanistan is a direct result of the hasty and disorderly withdrawal of foreign troops. He said, relevant countries should take responsibility for the past 20 years in Afghanistan and keep in mind the Afghan people's interests. Meanwhile, the threat of terrorism may be far from being eliminated in Afghanistan after 20 years of U.S. presence there. Instead, the number of terrorist groups in the country grew from single digits to about 20. So, what's in store for Afghanistan? How could the nation move forward? On the very first day of an Afghanistan free of foreign occupying forces, let's go to the site in Afghanistan, in Kabul. Afghan reporter Zaihullah Mujahid with us. Mr. Abbasin, thank you so much once again. Now, I want you to tell us very briefly the people you've been talking to in Kabul, how they are feeling about the so-called very first day.
Hello, Wei. The reactions by the people of Afghanistan are different in many manners. Some of those who have been living under the umbrella of democracy that washed out away just in 2 months. And they say that the achievement must be gained and must be safeguarded. Where there is education, there is also press of freedom and others. And on the other hand, there were people celebrating all these things as the Independence Day of Afghanistan and the end of occupation of US-led foreign troops in Afghanistan. So the reactions are totally coming out about the issues. Some are concerned, some are in panic, some are some of them are really optimistic about the future of the country.
A mixed feeling, it seems. Also a mixed feeling, I guess, from the international community. What's next? One of the things is about the government that is promised to be open and inclusive from the Taliban side. Now we understand, Mr. Abbasian, that over the past 3 days, a leading council of the Taliban has been hosting a meeting among themselves and came to a close. Do we know any result coming out of that meeting? Likely, according to media reports, September the 3rd, the new government is going to be announced. Is that really reliable news?
Well, yes, there was a meeting which was led by a Taliban supreme leader, or the Emir, Mullah Hibatullah Akhundzada, and the Taliban leaders were there, including Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, the political chief of Taliban, and many others. But there is no specific date like when the government will be formed, because the devil is in the details, and that's why the inclusive government will face many other challenges, and Taliban are already facing. For example, there are still a troublous situation with the Northern Alliance in Panjshir Valley, and also some other political figures, while we see Taliban appointing their own members for the key positions in different ministries, and also other major keys like Kabul mayor recently appointed by the Taliban and removed the previous one of Ghani's government, Dawood Sultan Zui. So all these are the challenges towards an inclusive government, and the Taliban show their seriousness in this regard. While in action, there is much more differences that we can talk about.
Another point, which is about the press conference just wrapped up a few hours ago by the Taliban side, talking about the prospect of the country and also cheer for the so-called independence from any foreign occupation. But one of the things they've been talking about is the economy. Everybody knows it's the economy is stupid, right? If the economy is not working well, nothing will work well. Though, Mr. Abbasian, do we hear any specific announcement of policy from the Taliban side on that?
There is no specific policies on regard of economic issues, and also financial affairs of Afghanistan inside, outside regionally. But the Taliban are showing their will and seriousness, and they've been appointing several key people. I was talking about the Afghanistan Bank, or the Central Bank of Afghanistan, with the Zaihullah Mujahid, that how much he has experienced. He told me that he has been a very experienced person, because he has been doing finances of Taliban since last 18-19 years, and that's why. And the best thing about him, he told me, that is honesty, and we will prevent corruption, and the things will be accountable. So this is another challenge for the Taliban. If the major educated, experienced people which have already fled, and other are in fear, and they are like put aside and isolated, that would be difficult for the Taliban to form a new government, particularly to enjoy booming economic and financial opportunities.
Zaihullah Abbasian, our correspondent in Kabul for us. Thank you so much, Mr. Abbasian, for your around-the-clock work. Really appreciate it. With us in the studio, Li Guofu, director of the Center for Middle East Studies from the China Institute of International Studies. Mr. Li, we have about 2 minutes. Very briefly, to analyze what you have just heard, what's going on in Afghanistan.
I think, the Afghanistan, they were going to announce the new government, but exactly what, the makeup of the new government is still unknown. But according to Taliban spokesperson, he said very clearly, the priority for the new government or Taliban is the economic development. But immediately, Taliban needed first, the immediate international assistance, food, financially. But for the long term, they need, a kind of economic development strategies. So Taliban would provide a kind of security, a kind of opportunities, a kind of support for those who were working with Taliban in promoting or developing Afghanistan's economic This will be very clearly signals.
I see. It is the economy that they put as a priority. And 40 seconds before we go, we have seen the international community want to listen to the words of the Taliban, but at the same time want to further observe their actions. Now, from the Chinese side, what do you see are some of the most important areas to observe in Afghanistan? Very briefly.
I think in the first, the international community should provide a kind of a support. The second, we want to see the immediate action, which is Taliban government would cut ties with all the terrorist organizations.
Li Guofu, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. You are watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Coming up, some soul-searching on what went horribly wrong with 2 decades of U.S. occupation in Afghanistan. How could Afghans pick up the pieces from years of conflict, the legacy and big lessons of American occupation? Up next for discussion.
The world is changing fast, taking all our lives with it. But we can change it too, by seeking answers to problems through discussions and debates. On World Insight, I ask direct questions to real people in the know, seek genuine answers, but respect diverse perspectives. Our live global debates tackle the most critical issues head-on. World Insight with Tian Wei go beyond the headlines.
Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. This is our very special program on the end of 20 years occupation in Afghanistan. The end of U.S. military presence in Afghanistan is only the beginning for reckoning with the country's deep-rooted troubles. 2 decades of conflict leaves questions on the colossal U.S. failure for national building and peace. Earlier, I spoke to 4 guests from different regional and global players. We discussed the U.S. chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, the specter of terrorism looming across Afghanistan, epitomized by the fatal bombing near the Kabul airport on August 26, while fighting flares up between Taliban and opposition forces in the Panjshir Valley. In Islamabad, Musharraf Zaidi, senior fellow of Tabat Lab, it's an Islamabad-based think tank. In New Delhi, Saurav Sarkar, who is a visiting fellow with Stimson Center Against the Terror. In D.C., Michael Kugelman, Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate with South Asia Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Last but not least, in Beijing, Yang Xiyu, Senior Research Fellow from China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us from different parts of the world on this very important issue. What do you make of this 20-year-long war and an apparent chaotic withdrawal? If I could ask you for one key word, what do you think is that reason and that key word?
Misunderstanding. I think that there simply was an inability of U.S. officials through successive governments in the United States to really understand what was happening in Afghanistan. And there's a failure to properly understand the country and a failure to properly understand that expectations and objectives were much too ambitious. And I think that at times the U.S. sought to do things in Afghanistan that simply could not be done, try to make Afghanistan appear more like the United States. So I think that there was a clear lack of understanding throughout much of the last 20 years.
Mr. Sarkar, I also want to ask a key word from you and the reason you see as why it's 20 years and why the chaotic exit.
And thank you, Wei. Well, to put it in one word, the problem would be a desynchronization with ground realities in Afghanistan. Often what the administration was trying to do did not match with the realities on the ground or the prevalent system of governance and society in Afghanistan. So as Dr. Kugelman mentioned that what the administration was trying to do was not always compatible with what was happening on the ground or how the society was structured in Afghanistan.
Mr. Zaidi, you are from the region as well. What is that keyword you have in mind?
Not being aligned. So misalignment would be the word. I think it's very similar to what sort of said, desynchronization. You know, there's no reason, for example, for the U.S. government to have openly announced its preference of India as the key regional partner in Afghanistan. And we can see, given, you know, India's complete lack of awareness of what is happening in Afghanistan and its inability to help in any way, either the evacuation or the stabilization process, that was a bad choice. But that's not the only bad choice. There's been a consistency of bad choices that the U.S. has made over the last 20 years.
Bad choices. Mr. Yang, what about that keyword from you?
It's a really key question. I'm afraid I have to use a key phrase, say, resetting a regime. During the past 20 years, originally they wanted, because of Bin Laden, because of Al-Qaeda, because of terrorism, the U.S. launched the war. But following the war, most of the time they have been doing can be summarized as a resetting a regime, U.S. modeled. And they failed. So the current withdrawal, based on the calculations, say no hope to sustain the regime, no hope to settle down the regime. Then they withdraw, and the sudden withdrawal obviously is the reason for the current chaotic.
Mr. Zaidi, the drone attacks happened just last days of the U.S. withdrawal, which, according to various media reports, killing 8, 9, or 10 people. It varies according to different reports, but the U.S. Central Command is now investigating it. We do not know the result yet. However, these drone attacks are likely to continue, according to the Secretary of State and the U.S. strategy. How do you see the two sides of these kinds of actions?
I think that the issue of drone strikes has been one of the most tragic outcomes of the modernization of war. But I think that beyond any other concerns, countries that have a terrorism problem in their borders are going to face not just the pressure of drone strikes, but also the diplomatic and economic pressure that comes with those terrorist groups. You know, they may work in killing the odd terrorist leader because they have proven to have done that. Drone strikes, first of all, it's interesting that we're talking about drone strikes finally on the last day of the U.S. presence in Afghanistan, because the U.S. has been using drone strikes for over a decade, and there's been upwards of 3,000 drone strikes that have been used in this war on terror. On some occasions, these drone strikes have successfully killed terrorist leaders, but almost on every occasion, they've also killed people that are debated as to whether they were innocent civilians or not. And even if there's even one person that's debating whether they're innocent civilians or not, the wider effort of the U.S. is undermined because the U.S. does not come out as the good guy that's protecting the world from terrorists. The U.S. comes out as the bad guy that's killing innocent people. That 20-year record is not going to change if the U.S. continues to use drone strikes. So drone strikes are an effective, sometimes, but very costly instrument of war. And I think that the 20-year lesson, again, needs to be, and I doubt will be, but needs to be, that in addition to drone strikes, the U.S. has to be aligned with the governments of the countries of the region in a global and regional compact against terrorism.
Since all of you agree that it is extremely important that we talk about the anti-terror issue, let's move on to that issue. And eventually we're going to discuss the future of Afghanistan from different perspectives, as you earlier lightly indicated. Let's talk about anti-terror issue in Afghanistan. Mr. Kugelman, according to the Secretary of State's speech, which I listened to, the U.S. is trying to enforce the promises Taliban made earlier about not letting Afghanistan be the training ground, harboring area, and also the place for terrorists to launch any attacks against other countries. But the question really is how to enforce that.
Well, it's going to be very difficult now that the U.S. is no longer in Afghanistan. And just to emphasize here, the agreement, the U.S. government, the Trump administration signed an agreement with the Taliban in February of 2020, and it didn't really oblige the Taliban to do much at all. One thing it obliged the Taliban to do was to let U.S. troops leave the country without shooting at them as they left. And the other thing was that the Taliban had to deny space to al-Qaeda to plan and mount attacks on the U.S. and its allies. So there was a very specific counterterrorism obligation on the Taliban in that agreement. But it's very difficult. It's been very difficult for the U.S. to monitor if the Taliban was abiding by that agreement, and certainly it'll be very difficult to enforce it. So I think at the end of the day, the administration, and Secretary Blinken stated this in his speech, the administration is not going to rely on the Taliban. The U.S. will essentially take matters into its own hands, quite frankly, using existing military facilities in the Gulf region to engage in surveillance of movements of terrorist organizations in Afghanistan, and perhaps even use airstrikes against terrorist targets. But I do think that the Taliban will curb ISIS-K, just because ISIS-K is a rival of the Taliban's, and for a number of years the Taliban has been fighting ISIS-K on the battlefield. That's not the case with most of the other terrorist organizations in Afghanistan, including al-Qaeda, which is the other main concern for the U.S.
Mr. Sarkar, it's no secret that the Taliban almost act as a shadow partner of the United States over the past few years against ISIS, but still we see intelligence cannot be implemented in terms of anti-terror actions. So it still doesn't count. So what does that say to you about, what are the priorities of anti-terror actions after August 31st?
The priorities for the Afghan state and the Taliban that is in power right now would be to minimize any attacks by ISKP, especially in urban areas, because not only would those attacks, put a question mark on the Taliban's ability to govern and to secure the people, they also cause a lot of damage. And ISKP is willing to use underhanded tactics such as, targeted bombings and assassinations of Taliban leaders to balance the ground, so to say. So for the Taliban, it's going to be very crucial that they do not let ISIS-K gain a grassroots hold anymore. Like it was there in 2015, 2016, but they will be keen that ISIS-K does not become an ideological rival for them. ISIS-K is unlikely to become a military rival because the Taliban is understandably more well-resourced and trained, but it will be very careful to not allow them to, gain more recruits or support in the countryside, for example, and those capabilities translate into more attacks in urban areas. So ISKP is going to be a concern for the Taliban going forward.
Mr. Zaidi, there are almost 20 terrorist organizations, depending on, of course, which country recognize which as the terrorist organizations, because countries are varied in that sense. But 20, more than the number 20 years ago in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, we also see, Mr. Zaidi, that different countries in the neighborhood have concerns about different types of terrorist groups. For example, China is very concerned about ETIM because of bordering Xinjiang. Meanwhile, you also see India's concern differently from that of Pakistan because the Pakistan Taliban is still a terrorist group according to many. And you also see that happening with other countries, Russia, for example, very concerned about ISIS. Iran is concerned about the Shia population on the border. So different countries, different neighbors, different concerns. And Taliban has promised different countries about not letting Afghanistan be a harboring ground and a place to let terrorists attack others. Now, what do you think, Mr. Zaidi, are some of the urgent actions that needs to be taken in Afghanistan with the support of the international community on that?
Well, first of all, it needs to be acknowledged that if the U.S., with having the greatest technological and material force available to it, more than any other country, really in human history, in partnership with 45 NATO ISAF partners, if 20 years of their presence in Afghanistan was not able to clean up Afghanistan and is leaving Afghanistan with a legacy of these 20 terrorist groups, then I think the first thing we need to do is acknowledge the reality and the realism that needs to infuse our thinking. The Taliban is not going to be able to get rid of most, or if any of these groups, but certainly not most of them. And therefore, the way in which this is going to be achieved is through partnership. Unfortunately, the record of the last 20 years, especially the US and other countries, the record of the last 20 years shows that countries are singularly interested in their own issues. So China is interested in ETIM, Russia and Uzbekistan are interested in Daesh, and they're interested in IMU. Pakistan is interested in the TTP. I just want to clarify, you mentioned the Pakistani Taliban. The Pakistani Taliban are the TTP. The TTP is an enemy of Pakistan. And Pakistan believes that the TTP has been supported by the enemies of Pakistan. So I think that, the Pakistani Taliban have nothing in common with Pakistan and are not pro-Pakistan. They are actually anti-Pakistan. The point being that for all of these different groups, different countries will have, as you rightly mentioned, different priorities. The challenge will be, can these countries work together? Can China and Russia and the US and Pakistan and Iran and India work together to support the Taliban in its pursuit of counterterrorism?
What do you think?
I think
what do you think is the answer for that question?
The answer is no. They will not be able to work together. And the reason is the distraction, misalignment, and desynchronization, which we talked about earlier, that afflicts Washington, D.C. Currently, Washington, D.C. is afflicted by a anti-China disease. And this disease is causing it to misinterpret world events and misalign its priorities in regions and places all over the world. Frankly speaking, its choices over the last few years in terms of who to partner with and who to pressure are also informed by the question of China. As long as the US treats China like the overarching strategic issue through which every problem needs to be looked at, it will not be able to work with China. And I think that more than any two countries, it is China and the US that have the greatest hope of working together and creating a positive outcome in Afghanistan.
Many would say, are you trying to escape the responsibilities from Pakistan?
Well, we've been answering that question for 20 years, and for 20 years, almost the entire time, it is Pakistanis that have suffered the most outside of Afghanistan.
Okay.
Other than Afghan women and children, it's Pakistani women and children that have suffered the most terror. So no, Pakistan is not looking to escape any responsibility, but Pakistan wants its friends and its foes to understand that the challenge in Afghanistan, like the last 20 years, is going to be failed if we start the journey with the wrong assumptions. Okay.
I'll let Mr. Yang and Mr. Kugelman to respond to that. Mr. Yang first.
Well, firstly, I'm not optimistic about the terror in Afghanistan because of two reasons. Number one, the different priorities between Taliban and the international community, say the various countries like China, US, Russia, Pakistan, and India, for example. Obviously, Taliban regime will certainly put stability, economic recovery as the top priority. Meanwhile, all of us, China, US, no matter how sharp differences we have a same or similar concern. Top concern is no terror attack again. So in short, we focus on anti-terror, but Taliban regime, for their sustainable existence, they will certainly put a different top priority on the other issues. And number two, the incapability of the Taliban regime to deal with quite a varied terror groups all over the Afghanistan. You mentioned there have been about 20 terror groups. In general, Taliban has controlled or has captured the whole country, but they haven't got control every corner of that country. And the 20 plus groups control the different parts of the country and have different interest focuses. I don't think Taliban regime can cover all of the terrorist group and contain all of the groups from launching attack abroad.
Mr. Kugelman, wrong focus according to Mr. Zaidi for the US.
You know, I actually would disagree a bit in the sense that I don't think the US-China rivalry has to be a problem in Afghanistan. You know, this rivalry does not play out in Afghanistan as sharply as it does elsewhere in South Asia, as well as elsewhere around the world. I really think that, broadly speaking, the US and China share similar interests in Afghanistan. They're both willing to see the Taliban hold a position of power, though I think China is more comfortable with the Taliban holding more power than the U.S. is, so to speak. But more importantly,
where
the
does
US
that
and
come
China
from? It
both
was the
share-
U.S. that signed the peace agreement with the Taliban, right? To begin with.
Yeah, well, that wasn't a peace agreement. It was really a withdrawal agreement to get U.S. troops out of there.
Right.
The U.S. all along had wanted there to be a truly power-sharing arrangement in which the Taliban would share power with others, which I don't think is going to happen. But more importantly, the U.S. and China both want more stability in Afghanistan. They both want less terrorism.
Okay.
And I've been heartened by the fact that in recent months, the U.S. has been willing to decouple its tensions, not only with China, but also with Russia, to participate in some very important regional diplomacy on Afghanistan. If you look at the Troika Plus arrangement, for example, which of course involves the US, China, Pakistan, and Russia, the US is willing to engage with its rivals in that context, which I think is important. But the fact of the matter is the US is left. And certainly the US will continue to try to engage with the Taliban to the extent that it can, as I described earlier. But the US is basically gone. And I think this means that not just China, but other regional players, including India, are going to have to find ways to work together to address these issues of terrorism. Just because it's packed its bags and left, and it will not be coming back, in my view.
So you're saying U.S. just go like that, What can I do? And then withdraw, and then it's up to you guys. Is that what you're trying to say after 20 years? And also, by the way, Mr. Kugelman, sorry for my adding so much into this question. If you look at the origins of Taliban, if you look at the origins of some of the terrorist groups, both inside Pakistan and also in Afghanistan, it has a lot to do with what the U.S. did earlier in nurturing some of the groups for the U.S. interests. Those histories I don't need to repeat in long paragraphs to explain. Everybody knows it. Selective nurturing, selective counterterrorism by the U.S. side.
Right. Well, one could argue the notion of external sponsorship. Indeed, the U.S. had been involved years ago in working with the Mujahideen fighters that were fighting the Soviet occupation, and Pakistan was very much behind those fighters as well. But then, clearly the issue of external support for terrorist organizations in Afghanistan is very real. I think it's an open secret that Pakistan has backed the Taliban, and particularly its Haqqani network faction, for quite some time. Iran has also provided some levels of support to the Taliban at some times. And certainly there's a view among many, particularly in Pakistan, that external players, including India, are behind the Pakistani Taliban. I think that the fact of the matter is it's very complex.
Mr. Yang, just to be fair, I also need to let you respond to the earlier questions posed by your colleagues, whether China is going to be, quote unquote, on good terms with the Taliban and not pressure the Taliban to go against the terror. Meanwhile, also, Mr. Yang, I also wonder about that question of U.S. and China put forward by Mr. Zaidi. Without much trust and credibility in terms of the relationship, will China be able to cooperate with the U.S. on the issue of Afghanistan? Could you directly respond to these questions?
Yes, it's really good two questions. First, let me to the second as the first. China will certainly cooperate with the U.S. on the terror simply because terror issue and the terror issue cannot be divided by different groups based on different terror groups. So the key obstacle or key question mark for the cooperation between U.S. and China on anti-terror lies in the same standards, not double standards. Just now the host mentioned the term selected. So if U.S. and China respectively conduct the so-called selected policy on anti-terror, then we will face bigger disasters on terrorism. Only when U.S. China have a unified, fair standards and the terms of how and what the terrorist is defined, then we can have a effective cooperation. So by that sense, I think first thing for the U.S.-China cooperation is the two sides should start the dialogues and the discussion negotiations on the same term, same definition, and the same rules on the cooperation on the anti-terror. The cooperation on Afghanistan, I think many things can be done, but not only U.S. and China. And I think based on the UNSC as well as the Shanghai Organization, as
Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO.
We should organize an open platform inviting all the related parties, for example, India, Pakistan, China, Russia, all of them have been the member of Shanghai Organization, but also U.S. And with some other countries. We should have an international consortiums to discuss, to set a strategy, unified strategy on anti-terror. Then we can have a hopeful future.
Mr. Sankar, your comments, mechanism to work on. I think that's probably the most important question moving on from now.
Right. So a regional mechanism, as well elaborated by my colleagues, is a good concept on paper to counter terrorism, but it's difficult to implement in practice. There have been some success with the SCO and other such mechanisms, but often there are conflicting interests. Of course, when it comes to terrorism, the interests often converge, but political and geo-economic issues often will cause friction in the in any such cooperation being long-term or comprehensive. So, for example, in Afghanistan, Iran is also a very important player, but the US often may find it difficult to engage with Iran given the ongoing tensions relating to its nuclear weapons program and groups that Iran supports in the Middle East. So, translating the cooperation has some challenges. To get over those challenges, it's important to see the bigger picture going forward and understanding that Afghanistan is more than just a territory. It's a country of people and who would also want to engage with other countries in the region via trade and diplomacy.
Mr. Kugelman, from the U.S. President, Mr. Biden, he recently said in a speech that the U.S. goal 20 years there is not about rebuilding Afghanistan, nor about building democracies in the region. It's about the U.S. Way of curbing terrorism for its homeland. But if I could ask you about how do you see the next step of Taliban now in consultation with different factions, apparently, in Afghanistan to build a government, quote unquote. How do you see that government is likely to be? There were promises about open, inclusive. Do you see that prospect?
Yeah, I do think because of its desire to get recognition from a critical mass of governments around the world, I do think that the Taliban will include some non-Taliban leaders in its government. There's already been speculation that Hamid Karzai and Abdullah maybe offered some type of role in the government, but these would be tokens. These would just be a few, and I don't think that the non-Taliban leaders in the government would have a major role. You're going to have a leadership council of about 10 or 12 Taliban leaders who will essentially be running the show. I do think because there's such a serious economic crisis in Afghanistan, and since the Taliban is so inexperienced, doesn't have any experience with governance, and when it didn't really succeed. I do think that you may see the Taliban try to bring in some non-Taliban technocrats and maybe some economists, at least those that are still in the country, try to bring them into the government to try to deal with these policies.
Mr. Yang, go to you also about that question. We see there are different layers of challenges facing Afghanistan, and certainly whoever is going to be the ruling factor in Afghanistan. So some have been arguing, on the one hand, to pressure and engage Taliban both at the same time while doing rebuilding efforts and peacekeeping efforts. But I want to ask you from both the Taliban trying to form a government and the future, how do you see these different layers of priorities?
Different parties have different priorities. However, I think we should have shared keywords as the shared task. Say the keywords should be stability. Both Taliban and the international community should focus on how to make the whole country instability. Only when we based on stability, we can deal with varied challenges and concerns. I can see there will be huge disputes about the definition of inclusive governance. And the Taliban have their definition, and the US have their definition, and so on. But let's set aside the disputes. What about the inclusiveness? And just try the best to set inclusive governance, and then turn to the focus of stability. And only when we maintain the stability, we can deal with many other different issues like inclusiveness or humanitarian.
Without security, it is almost impossible for the Taliban to be more open-minded, to make the government more inclusive, and the list goes on. So, Mr. Zaidi, what is your thought about the priorities next before we wrap it up?
I think that before anything, including security, there needs to be an international effort that includes the US, that is focused on ensuring that the price of essential commodities in Afghanistan, cities and towns and villages, does not reach a point of no return, that the inflation crisis, the food supply crisis, and very soon the heating fuel, because winter is coming. In the next 2 or 3 months, the international community has a chance to convey to the people of Afghanistan that their well-being is not being disposed with and gotten, forgotten about just because the Americans have left. And there needs to be a humanitarian focus on the economy that serves the Afghan people. And if people can eat and they feel that the international community has not abandoned them, then our struggle to contain terror will be much more successful.
That's all we have for this special edition of World Insight. The 20 years invasion ends in Afghanistan. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching. Bye for now.